One, and we are good. Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming in tonight. I'm sorry for making you guys wait a little bit. We're having some conversations, some good conversations. Um, but yeah, tonight is going to be a very special and kind of a different episode because I really want to talk about the current situation that the U.S., our country here, is in terms of what's going on in Ukraine, in Russia, and also China as well. I have a lot of graphics I want to show, as well as some articles, and also some special guests. So, without further ado, let me go ahead and share those guests um, as soon as I get out of this solo. Okay, that was awkward. Okay, welcome, Stephen. Welcome, DC. Uh, also decolonize Buffalo. Sometimes my friends and I we called decolonize Buffalo. We shortened your name to DC. So, but hey guys, thank you for coming on. Um, I'm thankful to have this discussion with you because I think it's very important to talk about these issues and how they are going to affect not just us here in the U.S. but around the world. And it doesn't seem that things are going to stop, unfortunately. So going off the script here, it's important to look at like how we got here, right? And the first thing to look at is the problem in Ukraine, and I'll show that graphic here. And that is currently Russia has occupied the eastern part of Ukraine in terms of the Donetsk region. I'll show it here. Wait, it's not okay. It's not really good in terms of visibility, but this is Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and the Kherson region of Ukraine. And Russia has no plans on giving that up, right? But so this war is going to still continue. And if we look at how much money has been sent to this war, I think it's close to $100 billion, which is quite insane. And I don't want to say, oh, it is it's bad because the war, there's no end in sight. Um, and why does this matter to us? Of course, we have already tons of issues going on in the U.S. right now in terms of poverty, infrastructure. There could be so many things that could be fixed. There could be so many issues that could be alleviated if we use some of that money elsewhere. But as I said before, numerous Russian leaders have said they won't give up that land that they've occupied, and Ukraine isn't going to sit down and talk and have an agreement that they're willing to accept that. So we're going to continue to pour money into this conflict, and nothing really is going to stop, unfortunately, and our government's still going to continue. If you look at the overall relationship between Russia and NATO, it's not good. They both really despise each other quite a lot. Um, so as I said earlier, I don't know, what are your guys' thoughts? Like, do you see this war ending in any way whatsoever, or do you think that it's going to continue, or things will escalate in the future? Also, I wanted to make one thing clear. Please, respect my guest and say nice things, or else you're gonna have to exit through the back door. So, thank you.
That's the best exit.
Yeah, the back door it is though.
I think Stefan, you want to go first?
Uh, yeah, sure. As far as I think this is going to end anytime soon? I mean, not from NATO's perspective. I mean, why they don't really want it to end, you know? So there's lots of evidence for that. With all the moves with the defense, with the defense industry and the military industrial complex, everybody's over there. Zelensky's doing his rounds, fundraising everywhere. They just sent the tanks, they've been sending the HIMARS. And the HIMARS definitely have the capability to reach inside of Russia. They're just, deliberately choosing not to target. But like, no doubt they do have the capability. Yeah, I mean, I just, sending those tanks just says, it says a lot. I think those actions speak a lot louder than words. I mean, they sent them. It doesn't seem like it's going to slow down, and it looks like we're almost like back into kind of playing like a nuclear chicken scenario. No, I'm not the only one to believe this. Air Mate, you know, a lot of people on the left are, you know, speaking about that, you know, and it's like as always, you know, the imperial elites, you know, the PMCs, the professional managerial class, you know, they're acting like this is all normal, you know, business as usual, right? Just another day in DC, just another hot conflict zone, right? And not like that this could actually like end up, you know, being an exchange of superpowers.
Before you go to Collins Buffalo, I was going to add on. I just wanted to highlight the article here that pretty much talks about. Yes, we've sent HIMARS now, but now Ukraine, and we just sent tanks, and now Ukraine is asking for jets, fighter jets, F-16s. But right now, the United States and I believe the UK are not really for that currently, but in the future, it will likely happen. So it makes you wonder, what will Ukraine ask for next, right? Um, and the more advanced weaponry we send to Russia, the more Russia will escalate the situation, unfortunately. So yeah, Rick, you're free to go now if you wanted to.
Yeah, I see. I see your outline here. I think the first one is how we got here. I think
Yeah,
we have
how
to
we got.
understand, like, that NATO was created after World War II to contain communism, but after Soviet Union fell, they didn't disband, right? Actually, it's expanded, right, into closer to Russia, and Russia actually, Putin was the one that tried to have Russia join NATO, and NATO, I guess he kind of dismissed him. So, over time, you know, Putin, like I said, Putin lived during the Soviet Union, so he knows theory. He saw this coming. There was a 9-hour interview with him and some a director. It's on the internet. It's pretty good. It talks about his life and how he feels like there's going to be a clash between Russia and the U.S. because the U.S. politicians and capitalism. It's just this is how the system works, right? You can't work with capitalism. It's something with China. China is a semi-capitalist country, and even though they're playing the capitalist games and doing better than the U.S. in capitalism, just like Russia, you know, eventually the U.S. doesn't. Sellers don't like that shit when you play their game better than they do, right? So why it matters? Why I think I mean, I don't know if you want to do it one by one, but how we got here, you have to go back in the history to have um, proper analysis of right now. You also have to know that there's Operation Gladio and Operation there's another one where the U.S. Um, in Paperclip too. Paperclip, the U.S. brought Nazis over into the U.S. Nazi scientists, and Operation Gladio was the U.S. actually had like a shadowy, like a lot of the Nazis stayed in Europe in case, like they created a system where, like, if the communists invaded Europe, the Nazis would fight back, right? It's like militias and stuff like that. So, and Ukraine was a hotbed for Nazis in World War II, right? So a lot of the Nazis. This is why in 2014, when the conflict started, uh, the Maidan revolution was a neo-Nazi revolution, right? It was backed by the U.S., and a lot of them are Nazis, right? So this is a right wing. The U.S. is still funding Nazism. Nazism didn't get defeated, so now we have the Russians. Now they fighting against. Now they're going to have to fight against German tanks again, right? Filled with Nazis. Is this history repeating itself? So, yeah.
Kind of referring to the Azov battalion, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just like the most well known.
I think that's my one like critique that I had, like, that was against Russia for a while, was just the fact that, like, I heard about the Azov battalion, correct? And I heard about like how Russia came to Ukraine to denazify. Um, but I didn't think that the issues with Nazism in Ukraine was that bad. But now that you say that, it was much more widespread than what's being told to the general public. right?
Yeah, I remember Nazism has always been around in Europe after World War II. I remember when I was in the military, in the Navy in 2004, watching the World Cup, and you have those commercials with every country, they show clips of every country, the audience. And then when they show like some European, I think it was Germany or something, that have a bunch of people doing the Roman salute, like a bunch of people in the stands. I was like, holy shit, this is a fucking problem. This was in 2004. You imagine fast forward to now to 222, 223, you know what I'm saying? And I mean, like, look, it's the same thing here now. I mean, I think, one of the questions you asked why it matters, we have neo-Nazis from the US, especially here in San Diego, going to Ukraine, training to fight, having fight experience, coming back and training other neo-Nazis here domestically. And that's a fucking problem.
Yeah, no, straight up. They're definitely using this opportunity to do that.
Yeah. It's kind of not too hard to believe, especially like after World War II, right? And so many Nazis fled to Argentina.
Oh
And
yeah,
Chile.
came all they split them up between the Western Hemisphere, and then those that needed to stay in Europe stayed in Europe.
And we saw a lot of those soldiers go into positions of political power in these countries.
Oh yeah, no, like, especially like in West Germany, they just go straight into the security intelligence forces, and basically doing what they were doing with Nazis and SS officers. Yeah. They just were doing it now for for
Yeah.
And,
So now I
right.
can believe how that would be like a major problem as to why Russia would want to go into that, because there is like concrete evidence of the Azov battalion harboring these Nazi
Right.
soldiers.
The Steven Bandera guy.
Yeah.
I'm not, he professed to be like I'm some kind of huge historian in Ukraine's history and all, but we've all read the cliff notes and stuff by now, and that guy definitely wasn't a friend of anybody outside the right, for sure.
Yeah.
I think go back to NATO too. I think some of the early NATO leadership were prior Nazis too. If you Google, the leadership of what NATO is, just look into it. Just look into the history. Who were they before NATO was created? And you see it for yourself.
Do you think that NATO is willing to let Ukraine? They won't let Ukraine lose this war. They'll keep on sending more weapons.
Are you asking me that?
Yeah,
I think first off, I think people should check out the new Atlas. It's a YouTube channel, right? This dude is an ex-Marine. He has really good analysis what's going on in Ukraine. He cites his sources. I mean, who he cites is also really good too. I think there's like some Russian news outlets, but I think here's what I think is going to happen is, and what I think he said, and I do agree with. It's eventually Ukraine is going to start losing so bad, the U.S. is going to have to come in and beat buffer zones, right? It's just like in Syria, like the U.S. is in Syria and the Russians are in Syria, and they're like buffers within each other. They don't attack each other, but the rebels on one side, the U.S. side, and the Syrian army are fighting each other. It's like a proxy wars with the motherfuckers standing right next to them, right? So, yeah. I think something like that will happen.
Right. It's the same thing that's going on in Georgia too. I mean, you got to look at Georgia and Ostia, and the parts that, Russia is occupying now. And, the West went, only so far. There was a lot of weapons, a lot of stuff, a lot of positioning of troops. Shoot, like when I was in Europe in 2017, we did a big exercise where we left Germany, we drove all through Czech and Bulgaria, Romania, cross the sea over into Georgia, and the unit did some, exercises basically like within sight of the Russian guard posts on the other side, So there's always this like posturing that's going on, right? And so like, some of those buffer states, right, there's already kind of precedence in there. So, and Russia's managed to hold on to Crimea, I mean, who's to say that, right? I mean, Ukraine can't win this war without going into Russian territory. And I think that might just be something that like even the elites, or right now at least, like they're just, that's maybe just something they're not willing to, to sign off on yet.
I think um, I don't know, man. I think if you watch, if people know the beginning of the war or this, Ukraine situation, the Russians took a lot. They were taking like whole warehouses full of, Western weapons from the Ukrainian side, and there's also like prior service, like, like from Canada and the US. They have been in war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan, going into Ukraine, coming back and saying it's a totally fucked situation. They don't recommend people to go into Ukraine. There was a sniper from Canada uh, that he shared his stories. It's somewhere on the internet. I'll share it with you. But he was saying that, yeah, it's fucked. Don't go in there. Like people were getting magazines with only 10 rounds, right?
Mhm.
Or like no body armor. They were sending, whoever were volunteering. It was just like a bad situation. They were sending like all the volunteers to the front line so the Ukrainians wouldn't have to die. And it was just like it's like a slaughterhouse. So, and then the Russians are outgunning them by far.
Mhm.
There's no way they're going to win this war. In my point of view, I mean, the Russians are not stupid, and they know how to fight. If our our service members in the U.S. or Canada in the West are saying the Russians know how to fight, then I mean, like we went into Iraq and into Afghanistan with against a military that was not as strong as ours, right? And Afghanistan still were managed to push us out. Iraqis is in the same way too. Same thing in Vietnam. Do they really think they're going to push out Russians with a real military? They're not going to. Let's be realistic about it.
Right.
So you believe that there will be boots on the ground in Ukraine at some point, right?
But the Russian government, Putin did say anybody that's on the ground and gets caught by the Russian military that's not Ukrainian is going to be tried. It's not going to have the same opportunities that they should get as prisoners of war, right? Like the Geneva Convention says, right? And this includes anybody else. I don't think, I'll be honest with you, man. I don't think the U.S. is either they're not, obviously we're not strong enough, but either we're really dumb or we're just playing a game to, because obviously weapons companies are making money from this. Maybe they think this is a money making situation. They'll pull out when they say, oh, it's gotten too hot or something,
Mhm.
but I don't see if the U.S. government actually wants conflict. I don't think they want conflict. I think if they do, they're just stupid as fuck. Maybe they become too arrogant.
Hey.
Yeah. I remember, Steven, you had left a comment on one of the community posts about like what would be like the outcome or what like Ukraine should do. And you thought that like from the beginning that Ukraine should kind of its government so capitulate, but just kind of like end things, right? Like don't go any further. Like it's not worth it. Like
Right.
so you kind of believe that Russia's already they have too much power already. They have a bigger economy, they have a bigger military. So it's just best for Ukraine to lie down its weapons and accept.
I mean, to like to go back, like, and another little segue of like how we got here, right? Because this is a
Yeah,
lot of sectionality of how we got here, right? See,
sure.
like, what there's also a thing about the whole fact, like, when Ukraine was kind of ripped out of Russia's like traditional orbit, right? What a lot of people didn't forget, and that guy who does real life lore on YouTube, like, he did a really actually pretty good deep dive into this. Is Ukraine is also where almost all the petroleum infrastructure was at. So that's like all the Soviet Union's legacy, like petroleum industry, all the pipelines, all the like refineries, all the places where it could be mixed and stuff and go into Europe and out to the rest of the world. That was all mostly centered in Ukraine, right? So like after the dissolution of the USSR and the Russian Federation, and how the IMF and the neoliberals elites just kept pushing and pushing and trying to yank Ukraine out of that orbit. That was the main reason why, because up until the dissolution of the USSR, they were the world's preeminent petroleum drillers, everything. I mean, if you wanted to, the best and the best, like, people like about Texas and Wildcats and all that jazz. And while, yes, we do have a pretty experienced, US oil industry at that time, the USSR, they were far better. And that all that infrastructure was in Ukraine. So like Russia really took that as a huge sign of what the NATO, combined with NATO expansion into Poland and now into, other countries and stuff. It's just a clear sign that, their interests were threatened one way or another. And, that's why they're fighting so hard for that, because, I mean, in their eyes, that'd be like if, somehow, let's say Mexico ripped Texas out of the orbit of the United States economically, where, a lot of the oil and gas industry is concentrated. It would be a big disruption to the U.S.'s economy, like by far. So that's kind of, once again, how we got there in Ukraine, why Russia feels so threatened by this, and why they're not going to necessarily just stop. That's disregarding whether Putin has his own imperial policies and all that other jazz. That's not like an endorsement of Putin's government and saying Putin's absolutely justified in doing this, but there's a logic train there.
Yeah, thanks for your point, Stephen. Yeah, I agree. Um, Wanted to ask, Rick, kind of like talking about like the likely scenario, right? And I do agree that if you do the math, like Russia has 140 million people and Ukraine has below 40 million now after how many people have fled. Um, if you do the math with like the average like male fighting force in terms of like age, um, Russia has millions more that they could send to the front lines, right? So I believe that Russia will continue just sending more men until they believe they have exhausted Ukraine's military power in some way or another. Um, and then that's when things will escalate more. Because, as I said before, I don't see NATO um, accepting this, of course. And then, of course, like how it will affect us, right? We already see, the price of goods and food and wheat, of course, and bread has already gone up much more since the war started, right? So again, as things start to escalate, we will see these prices rise, unfortunately, and then we'll make the average American citizen suffer in some sort of like economic way, and that's what will happen there. I think there was another graphic I wanted to show here. Yeah, this one again, like just Ukraine war live. U.S. is reportedly ready to send $2 billion aid package to Ukraine. So another, few $1 billion sent there. So you have to wonder, how long is the American public going to support this, right? Because I have my own like views on Ukraine and Russia. Of course, I want to see like peace, and I hope things, can go back to the way they were. I don't think that will happen though. Um, it's only a matter of time before you push people to a certain edge where they don't want to support this anymore, and yeah, this war will continue, sadly.
This is just creating inflation in our country. Giving them free money, and giving them equipment. For $2 billion, we could fund a lot of things for $2 billion. This is capitalism run amok. And I can say, man, it's like we're not taking care of shit at home, and we're focused on war, and it's gonna bite us in the ass. So it's one of those things that capitalism is crumbling at home. I think as capitalism is crumbling, imperialism and colonization gets worse, right? So it gets more aggressive. So I think we're seeing it right now. We're seeing the fall of capitalism, and as they as it gets weaker abroad, it gets weaker at home, and vice versa. So I'm talking about colonization and capitalism. So I think this is probably the beginning of the fall of the U.S. empire.
Which is going to have some big ramifications on us when the economy suffers more,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
and this is why the conversation of decolonization is important, because if we don't know what it looks like, settlers have a vanguard, and the vanguard I have said is the military, it's police, it's the right wing militias, and it's the crazy settlers that are like January 6th type shits. those crazy evangelicals. All four of these things are going to uphold colonization in one way or another. We have to dismantle that system, you know, and we have to talk about decolonial theory, what it means, what does the system look like after the U.S. collapses? Because in reality, it could collapse. The economy could collapse, just like the Soviet Union. And what kind of government do we have after? Who's really out there in the streets being super aggressive? Right-wing militias that have trained in Ukraine.
Mhm.
Who here can pick up a gun, learn how to shoot? Who knows how to shoot a gun? Other me, ex-veterans like Stefan, But are we organized, in our communities to fight against neo-Nazi, militias? Let's be honest, you know. So we should, one of our goals should be to organize in our communities and see, educate ourselves on these issues to prevent that scenario from happening.
Yeah, no, for sure. Jumping into that, can things change?
Yeah, thanks for your guys' inputs on that. Yeah, I think yeah, again, I described like what will happen, how it's going, and that's ultimately what's going to happen in the end. Is that, yeah, the war will continue, as I said. So I wanted to really move on to China, right?
Oh, just
And
touch one thing on funding and how it affects us too, and it's really funny too because like a big part of like liberals, these like center left of people, that think like they're woke and mainstream, right? And like right now, like climate change is supposed to be their top priority. This whole war in Ukraine is just like showing that like that's all just lip service, right? Because like this is definitely contributing. The way that they've had to reorganize like Germany, the pipeline being hit in the sea, in danger of like that's a major pipeline and they're just blowing it up, to sabotage it and stuff. And like now without cheap Russian gas, like what's the rest of Europe have to do? You know what I mean? It just goes it just goes to show that fossil fuels too always take precedence, right? In the military expenditures and fossil fuels. It's just so we could sell more to Europe, you know, instead of Russia.
wait, you believe that the West was behind, or someone from NATO was behind
Oh
the
yeah, for
pipeline
sure.
explosion?
That's like the most likely scenario. There's just there's a lot, that's a lot of expertise to do. It's a lot really hard to think of my mind. Knowing what I know after my, over a decade of service and all that jazz, like that'd be pretty hard for some lone wolf to kind of pull off.
It seems that the media outlets want us to believe that Russia did it themselves.
I mean, right. I mean, but the fact is like it's happening, right? Like this conflict
Yeah,
causing those kind of actions taken. That's all I just wanted to say, like overall, right? It's
yeah,
just like,
certainly.
the overarching like problem as a civilizational level right now is like this dependency on fossil fuels, and we're still fighting over them instead of like decolonize them from them, because that's also a part of that. It's having to get away from that framework, because what's when you, and this is, gets back into land back, when we'll hop into China a little bit, because like what's the point of land back, right, when they give it to you all poisoned, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
right.
it's full chemicals or fossil fuel, infrastructure and legacy and all that. But they're like, oh, here, you can have this land back. Like, don't get me wrong, we're going to take it. But you know what I mean? Like, that how it affects us and what we should be spending our money on is more like remediation, right? And but yeah, no, let's hop into China for sure.
Yeah, I did want to say I do agree with you, Stephen, on the lip service thing. Like you see, like people saying, "Oh, save the environment," and then climate change this, and climate change that, and then you know, things don't really look the same on paper at the end of the day. But yeah. So I did want to get into China. So, um, to the audience, I've made videos about China before and the issue going on with Taiwan right now. Um, and again, the second component of this live is to discuss how, unfortunately, and this is from what I've seen, and I've studied this issue with China a lot longer than I have with Russia and Ukraine. I started observing these issues in like 2014 with the South China Sea, right? And how a lot of U.S. outlets were very much portraying this as something like very terrible and bad, and like showing scenarios of what will likely happen. And we're seeing a lot of outlets now almost normalizing war scenarios, right, with China. And it's not just like, oh, what do you think? Like it'll be Fox News or something. No, like it's CNN, it's all these outlets. Not only that, you have a lot of political pundits that are talking about how this war would go, and not just political pundits now, but now military people in the military and that are going on CNN. And let me show you guys really quick what I'm talking about. So go ahead and share this article here, and I believe it's a let me see, yeah, U.S. War General warns troops that war with China is possible in 2 years. So this guy here, um, Air Force General Michael Milhan, yeah, told his troops that we're likely going to be in a war with China. And this was from the Washington Post, and they believe that that China is unjust and that a war is likely, which is, in my view, this is very terrible to see because it's almost as if we're normalizing this problem now, as if like a war must happen in order to stop China. Um, so going in here, it's kind of like wanted to talk about how things started, right? So let me go ahead and share a few graphics of, why what we have done to normalize this situation. So what I'm talking about. So if we look at these two lines here, this here says the first island chain, right? And the second island chain. Many outlets like CNN, Fox News, and all these other channels talk about these islands that are chains that they're meant to contain China, and we normalize it as if that's okay. And China has accepted this. So I apologize. I'm still somewhat sick. This is basically preparation for some sort of war when we talk about some sort of style of containment of another country. Um, of course, I'm aware that China is not perfect and many countries have their imperfections, but the way that our government has gone about this pretty much shows that they are preparing for some sort of conflict. And even I myself um, do believe that it is somewhat likely within the century that we will get into some sort of conflict, whether if it's big or small, I'm not sure, right? But I think that when you have two great powers and they're completely polar opposite of one another and they have completely different geopolitical goals, some sort of conflict is likely to happen. Again, it could be very small, right? But there will be issues in the future, unfortunately. Um, so I don't know if you guys wanted to add anything to that so far.
I think for China, where it started, we had to go back to the Opium Wars, right? Where the British came in and they, forced opium onto China because they were in a trade deficit. So China was actually better
Right.
at trading than the British. So the British had to force the Chinese to bring in opium, and opium people were getting addicted, and China was like, hey, this is causing problems. So but then like the British, the way they are, they're like, no, you have to take this opium, and then they took Hong Kong,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And then you know it's like a long time of colonization, not just by the British, but also other countries. I think first off, if you go to my
Yeah.
podcast, Decolonize Buffalo, there's a whole series of Carl coming on and talking about Chinese history. We go back, we start from the opium wars to present day, right? And you have to understand that Shanghai itself used to be carved up into pieces by different colonial powers itself. So China has gone through colonization, and you know, um, a lot of, I think, is it Franklin Roosevelt? One of his grandfathers was like a one of opium runners in China. So one of the presidents was his grandfather was a narco. So a lot of this opium money funded the railroads to colonize indigenous peoples here in the U.S. Right, so our colonization is tied Africa, China, and the the indigenous here in the U.S. Everybody's colonization all happened with capitalism, right? So when China had their communist revolution, they kicked out obviously all the occupiers, all the colonizers, Japanese, the British, and they had the revolution, but the U.S. doesn't like that, because when China opened up their markets, this is really fast history, by the way. We opened up the markets and started playing the capitalist game. They were better at it by far. Their economy is growing. Look at their cities. Look at their cities from the 80s and look at their cities now. 100% so much bigger. Like I said, if you listen to my podcast, my stepfather is Chinese, and he says in his lifetime, China has gone through a tremendous change. Hong Kong is not the same as it used to be. Well, Hong Kong was a colony in the first place, right? It wasn't part of the mainland. It should be, but I think we have to go to the U.S. seeing this what I call a decolonial power that's Marxist, right? Growing an influence in the world, and they don't like that shit, right? It challenges their own power. So of course, sellers have to try to contain um a power that challenges their own, this pan-European powers, these colonizers, so I think, why it's important to know this stuff, because if you don't, you buy into CIA propaganda. China is evil, China does this, and China does that. A lot of this shit is CIA funded propaganda. We can't let that shit, uh we can't be buying that kind of shit.
Yeah, and one example of that, Rick, is when they talk about like, okay, so if China takes over Taiwan, the US media outlets are like, "Oh, well, then China can stop US shipping lanes." And I was like, "Why the hell would China do that?"
Yeah.
Why would they? Or if China took over the microchip production there, they're afraid that like, oh, well, maybe China will like do something with microchips or like take it over completely or not sell them to the US or something. Like China wouldn't do that. I just want to make it clear, by the way, that um, they did a poll in Taiwan, and I think most Taiwanese want to remain on the status quo, which is not independent, but obviously not a part of China. And I support Taiwan in that. I would rather things just be how they are now without an escalation because I don't want to see a war. Of course not. So I think that's the best scenario for everyone. But unfortunately, you have political pundits, as I said, that push for this. Let me bring up one example real quick. When I was talking about scenarios, I'm not kidding with you, and especially something that's like CNN, and I will share it right now. Um,
I want to
this
say something
here.
first about Taiwan.
Sure, sure, yeah.
Yeah, we have to understand that in 1971, the U.S., along with the UN, passed a resolution to say this the one China policy. So Taiwan is part of China,
Right.
right?
Nixon.
Yeah, exactly. So there is no
Kissinger.
China and Taiwan are separate. No, the policy that the U.S. agreed with is the one China policy. Like the US fucking signed this shit, right? So when Nancy Pelosi came in there and when all this shit happened last year, China, all they had to say is like, hey, what happened to the resolution of 1971? Are you going back on your word or what? These motherfuckers want to sign treaties, but they don't want to uphold them, just like they did at home here abroad with the Native Americans, right? You want to sign treaties, but not uphold them. You fucking racist white motherfuckers. Excuse my language. So, go ahead. Sorry.
Uh, if you if you look at the State Department, it also says that the U.S. Supports the one China policy, right? But it's
Yes.
hard to believe that when you have so many politicians. What's the one in Georgia? Her name is like Major Taylor Greene or something. The
Hmm.
one that's crazy. Um,
She's super nutty. Yeah.
yeah, she likes was like making like tweets saying like I support or like Taiwanese independence or something. And there's other politicians that believe that too. And I believe that what's her name? Uh, the gosh, the woman that just retired from her position from the head of Congress or the House, Nancy Pelosi, right?
She
Yeah.
retired.
I really, she was trying to stir things, right? I don't believe she had the best intentions going to Taiwan. And I would believe that everyone in this panel would probably agree with me, right? Like she went there to stir stuff with Taiwan and China, right? I don't know what she was trying to do. Was she trying to get China to bite?
It kind of looked like it. They were trying to get China to bite. I was like, you're sacrificing yourself for a bigger war or what? You sound pretty stupid. But China obviously has better restraint than
Yeah.
to start a fight over that. I mean, it's the same thing with Hong Kong. There's a policy of reunification, right? It's 50 years. it's like 100 years process or some shit like that, so eventually Hong Kong will be part of China. There's a transfer period going on right now. It used to be part of colonized. Now it's being what I think decolonized, and then there's propaganda about it, like, oh, the mainland is like they're like coming here and they're colonizing us. They're using like you know they're like indigenizing. Wait, how do I say this? They're trying to make propaganda through like it an indigenous lens, but to better to like to make it work for the settlers, right? Which is ironic. It's just kind of like Zionism, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
like modern day Taiwanese population, they're not what you would call indigenous to that island. What we historically we understood within the context of 6,000 years of Chinese civilization, and in that area, right? Like they're relatively newcomers from the government that lost in the Civil War. So yeah, and it's interesting, right? They try to put it though, like they've always been a Taiwan,
yeah.
where in the context of when you look at the long view of China, and kind of just a generalized nation, but China does have a more long view in their nations and their government society. They're definitely more forward thinking than the United States, which is relatively young at 300 some odd
Mhm.
years, right? Of what people would consider, the European settler presence on the North American continent.
Yeah, I think if you go to the podcast, like the Decolonized Buffalo, my podcast,
Yeah,
there's a Taiwan episode. It's like 3 hours long,
yeah,
right?
because yeah, you can get
Yeah,
into sure.
we get into like a very far history of Taiwan, and that they've always had a relationship with China. It's different from like that relationship with each other, mainland and Taiwan, compared to Europeans coming here on this continent and fucking everything up, right? You can't compare the two. So
Don't they say
Someone else doesn't.
soup here in the chat?
I think that's like a shitty CIA talking point about the bad loans. So at least my point of view.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've heard a lot of African
compared to
leader-
IMF, like
Exactly.
aren't exactly great. I mean, right? Neoliberal loans are traps in their own way. So, like,
Rick, you bring up a good point, and that is that I spent time in China. I met a lot of people there, and they themselves believe that Taiwan is inherently part of China, right? And they believe that it will go back to them in some way, um, whether that's through peaceful means or military means. I'm not sure what their thought process was on that. Um,
I remember
so
in 97, like I said, my stepdad's Chinese and he's from Hong Kong. I remember in 97 when they started the unification back to China from Hong Kong, there was a big, within our family, there was a big celebration, right? We went out to dinner, we celebrated, yeah, like, colonization is going to go away, blah, 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 right? So, yeah, even he told me when I was growing up, Hong Kong is part of China. We are Chinese, right? I mean, he speaks a different dialect. He speaks Cantonese. He doesn't speak Mandarin, but he's still Chinese. He sees himself as Chinese, right? And we have these conversations even now. Even now, when I go visiting him, I went to visit him this last weekend. We talk about like the growing power of China, how he's proud of it, right? There's no like we're different from the mainland. No, it's like we're one China.
yeah, yeah, that's interesting to get that from your family's perspective, Rick. I did want to show that scenario, right, and how news media outlets are normalizing these simulations. Here is one from CNN. War games suggest Chinese invasion of Taiwan would fail at a huge cost to the U.S. Chinese Taiwanese military. So they believe that the Chinese invasion of Taiwan would fail. Um, but here's the thing that kind of, well, I mean, all of it concerned me, right? But here it is. At the end of this conflict, at least two U.S. aircraft carriers would lie at the bottom of the Pacific, and China's modern navy, which is the largest in the world, would be in shambles. It's not the ending. Of course, it's terrible. The first year is two U.S. aircraft carriers. I think for those of of the audience that don't understand like how many people run an aircraft carrier. M- Most aircraft carriers in the US have like 4 to 5,000 people on them, correct? So
Yeah,
that's 10,000 Americans that would sink to the bottom of the ocean. So I think the US government and their media lackeys, as I will say, need to ask the American people if they're willing to lose 10,000 Americans in some sort of war, right? They're predicting that these American ships will sink to the bottom of the ocean. So you have to ask yourself, is this war worth it? Is it worth the American death toll? No, in my opinion, I don't think it's worth it.
You know, it's ironic about the ships being on the bottom of the ocean. There's a documentary. This is a little bit off topic about this one person that goes and checks on sunken ships from like World War II and how they have like thousands of of gallons of fuel still in these ships, and they get monitored around the world because they're slowly leaking, some of them, right? And they're an environmental disaster. So this war that the US plans with China, first off, the logistics is fucked because we would have to travel all the way to other side of the Pacific to go with China, right?
7,000 miles.
Yeah. And then and to like just create another environmental disaster. You know what I'm saying? On top of that, I think this is my point of view. It wouldn't just be a war between the U.S. and China. Japan's gonna get their
right.
hands into it. They need Japan's help, and Japan and China don't have a good relationship. Japan colonized. Or they colonized and occupied a lot of the Pacific, and they did a lot of brutal shit, right, in the past. And a lot of people, Filipinos, Koreans, Chinese, they do not like Japanese people, and rightfully. They did genocide, which people don't talk about during World War II. The Chinese went through a genocide, right? We talk about the Jewish Holocaust, which is bad, but we also have to acknowledge the Chinese Holocaust, which I think was like 10 million or something like that, right? And I think, and nobody talks about that here in the West. We don't talk about the crimes of, that we sponsored. In the beginning, we helped Japan become this superpower in the East. We helped them, and they got too big against the U.S. Their manufacturers got too big, and they said, "Oh, Japan's bad." Blah blah blah. It's the same repetitive history. Oh, Russia got too big, it's bad now. China got too big, it's bad now.
Yeah.
So, and then the Koreans will obviously get involved, but they have their own conflict. I mean, this conflict with China is just kind of domino into a bigger conflict around the world.
You think that, I mean, Japan doesn't really have a choice. I mean, I feel like they have to get involved in this whether they like it or not.
Well, I mean, kind of. I mean, it did have a choice to an extent, but that's one of the reason why, Abe was possibly, targeted was because under his reign, the Japanese changed their constitution. So now they allowed the Japanese Self-Defense Force to conduct offensive operation outside of Japanese territory. And it was kind of like, during the global war on terror, they had sent support units to Iraq and Afghanistan, mostly like medical or engineering, definitely not combat troops, but the Japanese Self-Defense Force did deploy in the global war on terror. Um, and that was a big, huge break from them. That was like some of the first time they had been outside of, Japanese home territory since the end of World War II. And so now the Japanese state has actually changed their constitution to allow offensive operations. So, that's just it. And that, of course, that's coming from the CIA, that's coming from State Department, that's coming from US pressure to, contain China, once again, this whole containment theory that's been around, at least since the 40s, of how we're going to control communism, especially as it pertains to Southeast Asia, right? Containment. And it didn't work then, and it's not going to work now.
No, I think we have to look at okay.
Opinion, I mean, it's just not going to
Yeah.
work. And they're trying to do it through lots of ways, I mean, but even within the elites themselves, and like I said, the managerial class, I mean, they're having conflicts over approach this amongst themselves. Like, the Marine Corps is going through a huge transition period right now. It's going through, it's getting rid of infantry, the battalions. It's getting rid of all its heavy tanks. Like, it's going to have 0 tanks. It's trying to rely more on like land-based anti-ship missiles. And there's a lot of people within the Marine Corps and recently retired, they don't agree with even that pivot to that strategy. So it's not so much that they disagree with the war games and stuff, but like they're disagreeing amongst themselves about what strategy to even take on this, which is like insane on its own head. it's like it's never talk about less war or counting down. It's just like how can the narrative's only around how can we fight the war, not whether we should fight the war or not. It's always like, well, how can we fight this war? And and China does have some major strategic weaknesses. I mean, most of their traffic goes through the Straits of Malacca, and Singapore is definitely within the U.S. military orbit. And if you none of you guys are familiar with the Straits of Malacca, you can Google it. But I mean, it's where like most 70% of the world's trade goes through this very narrow strip of land, and that's why Singapore is an insanely rich city state. And the U.S. Navy basically treats it like we do a lot of open water and open passage navigations. And I've been through the pass on a U.S. Navy ship, and it's wild though. I mean, it's like all this
Yeah.
crowd around you. I mean, it's like you can see the island, you can see the land, and you just it's just constant ship traffic though. Huge tankers, huge cargo containers, all that stuff. But
I do want to
so
say too about containing.
yeah,
Sorry.
no, go ahead. Yeah,
About Marcus, you said about the U.S. trying to contain communism. We have to acknowledge that, especially for example, South America, we have been moving to the left. Brazil voted in a leftist president, right? Colombia, uh, in my time growing up in the 90s, Colombia was super right wing. Now it has a leftist president. I was shocked. Really, what happened in Bolivia? There was the right wing coup, and what happened? That coup got pushed aside, and and again, another still they kept their leftist president. Mexico, I'm surprised myself. Mexico now has a leftist president, not as left as I would want it to be,
right,
right? But
right.
still more left than usual, and now also talking shit to the U.S., right? So the world is changing. The U.S. is losing its power abroad. For example, going back to Russia, when they did the vote to sanction Russia, the only people that agreed to it was the European powers and fucking Japan. Nobody else fucking wants to sanction Russia because nobody wants to play colonizer games. So I think the Europeans are losing power. And it's a matter of time.
But I will say one thing about like, you have a good point, Rick. And I think I just want to add like with China and Russia and like what you were saying, right? In terms of like the how the ongoing war with Russia and NATO. I think that China is kind of biding their time and letting Russia fight this war and then let Russia continue to be more dependent on China, right? Um, I don't know. That's just something I've been thinking
Doesn't
about.
happen right now. Would it happen when they did a sanction and the U.S. took tried to when they tried to sanction Russia, and a lot of banks were like, "Oh, we're not going to work with Russia." What happened was it pushed Russia closer to China, and China came in and was like, "Hey, we can help you with your systems, blah blah blah." And now a lot of the world wants to de-dollar themselves. They want to move away from the dollar, which that's going to fucking hurt the U.S. economy,
Yeah,
right? Once country starts to moving away from the dollar,
yeah.
and
Well,
it's like I said, it's a matter of time. People are becoming smarter, wiser about this, and nobody wants to play white people games anymore.
Have you seen that Peter Z. Hein guy?
No.
He's like some geopolitical strategist, and he just like made a video be like, "No, the dollar's not going anywhere." It was kind of funny to see him like freak out.
the petrodollar. Yeah, but I mean, I will say this in regards to the BRICS coming together, and every year, they come closer and closer, and they were talking about kind of having like a basket of world currencies instead of just one, right? So like, collectively, they all put it together in some kind of fund, and that would be a counterweight against the U.S. petrodollar. But again, insofar as like the BRICS like having a formal structure to actually counterweight that, I mean, people have been saying they're going to do that for the last 30 years. So while I think the war in Ukraine definitely forced Russia and their central bank, like they got kind of caught off guard of how fast like the U.S. Treasury Department and that whole infrastructure was able to just freeze all their assets and confiscate as much as they could, much as they did to the Afghan people in the nation state of Afghanistan when the U.S. took all the billions of dollars from the treasury. So I mean, they do have an ability. So but we'll see. I mean, I think this is the closest that Russia's ever felt that they really need to go forward with that. But insofar as like the BRICS having something tangible, that's not there yet. but we'll see. Like Rick was saying, that it's things are looking good for left in the Western Hemisphere at least.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that China also owns a lot of like industry in the US, like Tesla. It's like 10% of Tesla,
Hmm.
right? There's like they bought a lot of like industry in Europe, you know, and they like I said, they played the game real good, and now the colonizers are just mad about it, and they have to find a way to take this back, and they're not going to be able to. History is changing. I really advise people to read history and read theory, because if you don't read theory, the motherfuckers are going to trick you and and fool you. Those motherfuckers, I mean the colonizers, right? They'll feed you propaganda. You have to read theory,
Right.
right?
And I wanted to add one other thing is like here's where like the U.S. military bases are, right? So I was talking about earlier, if the U.S. gets into a confrontation with China, Japan, I mean, they do have somewhat of a choice, but in order for the U.S. to launch like strategic attacks, they would have to launch it from Okinawa, right, in the southern parts of Japan, which would bring Japan into war with China as well. It makes me think like, does Japan really want that? I mean,
Well,
and
I can tell you the Okinawans don't. I can tell you the Ryukyuans, the Okinawa
yeah,
haven't been there, haven't served there twice for about a year. I can tell you there was constant protests, that and a lot of people in Okinawa don't even necessarily feel close to the Japanese national government either, because they were a relatively late addition to the Japanese empire.
Yeah, we have to understand too that Guam and Hawaii.
Right, and that's part of the reason why
Yeah.
got repositioned to Guam was because of the constant protests and the constant crime and international incidents that were happening on Okinawa. So that was a big part of why the Marines got pushed out to Guam.
So yeah, so Guam and Hawaii are both military occupations. Hawaii was taken away unlawfully from the indigenous peoples of that, the Kanaka people, and they had their own monarchy. People need to really understand the history of the U.S. in Hawaii. So if the U.S. goes to war with China, obviously Hawaii will be, because Hawaii is a big base there, right? And you have, we have to understand that who gets affected by that war. The native people in Hawaii, the native people in Guam, the native people in Okinawa, right? Because some of them don't consider themselves Japanese, right? So like these people are going to be affected. People in the Philippines, which is right next door, right, will be affected. So people in Vietnam, it's just it's a fuck fest.
that's what I was trying to explain to my friends. Is just like I believe when I was like surprised, Rodrigo Duterte, who was the previous president of the Philippines, I guess he agreed to having a base be opened up in Olongapo, like near Subic Bay, which is in the northern Philippines. So by doing that, when this confrontation starts, of course, the U.S. is going to launch attacks from that spot, right? From that base, from fortification. That base is going to be screwed because China's going to launch hypersonic missiles at that base. Like, I don't.
Well, yeah, like Bay was an old naval base, and then it got turned over to the Filipino government, and then it was kind of like the U.S. Navy rents infrastructure there. But yeah, I think they might have reconverted some of it to direct control by the U.S. Navy.
We have to understand too that this war, whether it's for Russia or China, is going to be a different war. And I was, because I talked to locals here. We do have a small gun club here, and warfare is not going to be the same as World War II. People have drones now.
Yeah,
We didn't have that shit when I was in, right?
yeah.
So drone warfare changes the game completely. But what's going to happen is these superpowers are going to shoot down each other's satellites too. China tested it, right? They shot down a satellite. It's to show, hey man, like we are, a superpower too. So we're going to have people shooting down satellites. So communications are not as good. We have drone warfare, and it's going to be real messy. Hypersonic missiles, which Russia used them in Ukraine, and the U.S. couldn't even see it coming. There's no warning, right? So these are things that we need to realize that there's weapons out there. They're super fucking scary. So it's not something I look forward to. I'm getting older, so I don't, I can't be fighting these wars. I'm not going to, right? So I refuse to participate in this kind of shit.
Yeah. No wars but class war, man.
Yeah. And I
Yeah,
think it's just important just for people to understand that like China is a very big trading partner of the US. So if you look here, the value of US goods imports from China rose from 100 billion in 2001 to 500 billion in 2021. So our economies are so intertwined with one another. Having that sort of conflict would be devastating. It would bring catastrophe to the global economy, not to mention jobs as well. So exports are trying to support nearly 900,000 US jobs. Chinese companies invest in the United States employ over 160. So all of jobs are invested in this as well. So yeah, I don't want to see like conflict either, but it's just as I've said in previous videos, I don't trust many people that work in the U.S. government. Um, so that's pretty much it. Um,
I think people need to protest more. I mean, people were protesting the Iraq War. They're not protesting, this shit against China. They're not protesting this shit against Russia. We're not really protesting shit. And to me, that's scary because that we having people getting killed in the streets, and there's no real big protests. And I'm just like, are people in this country that oblivious? Are they just so isolated into their lives? That they're just letting the U.S. government do whatever they want. They're letting the U.S. government send all this money to Ukraine and causing inflation, causing, problems at home. I'm just, it's weird.
the outlets are too busy. And they want to focus the attention on that guy in New York, that politician. I don't know what his name is. And they want to focus on the January 6th riots still. So, you know, I think the media is very good at the directing the attention and focus of a lot of the American populace. And it's not on the issues that will really affect us in
yeah.
the future.
Because to them, it's all about that. It's all about that warfare state. I mean, because conflict to them is just inevitable because the U.S. has to be centered. You know what I mean? Like we have to be in control of this unipolar world. In the elites and like I said, in the managerial classes' eyes, like and all the people that aspire to that.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for that point. Yeah, I agree. And Rick, I think you made a good point too about like, yeah, pretty much going towards the end here is like, how can we become more aware, like having like protests and whatnot, right? Um, I think a lot of media outlets in YouTube do a good job at showing the truth on what's really going on in the world, um, and then what can be done to like stop this collision. I think just more people like rising up and not wanting to support these suicidal wars, you know. Um, because
Yeah,
it's just gonna bring more problems to us.
no, I definitely know what Rick's talking about. Speaking like what happened to the anti-war left, like kind of coming of age during Bush, during that transition between Bush the second and Obama and stuff. I definitely know, there was definitely a presence, and even up into Syria, even with the libertarians and stuff. Like when I was doing stuff like 10 years ago in like 2012, 2013, and protesting around Houston, and kind of the trail end of all the Occupy and getting plugged into that. we were still like saying, no to that. Whereas like we're this Ukraine, I haven't seen any like yeah, to speak to Rick's point, I haven't seen any organized protests from the left, from the right, from anywhere against this war in Ukraine, which is wild.
And
Yeah, like it's wild. Like everybody's like hooked into Zelensky action, the last action hero.
it's just like everybody went to brunch when Biden was elected. Was that
Right.
meme that went around? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. All the white allies, all the white allies.
At brunch.
Yeah.
Fucking taking all of avocados from us and shit. What the fuck? Avocado toast.
Yeah. Uh, fucking up toast.
No, but for real, I think people needs to there's two aspects within this. We have to understand history,
Yeah.
and this is why I created the China series on the podcast with Carl, right? Because I saw this coming right before I even started the podcast, right? I invited Carl on, and I'm going to continue because there's so much about misconceptions about China that I think people need to to dispel them. And I think the next part is reading theory. You have to understand to understand the game, you have to understand even reading the capitalist theory, right? You have to read and to understand. You can't just read one. You can't be just dogmatic like the Jedi, right? But you got to read everything. I'm a Marxist, right? So, but but I still have read the capitalist stuff. But then even then, there how capitalism's being done now is really fucking scary, and we're going to a fascist, I think a fascist state, 100%. You know, we're already in a fascist state. The settler state's a fascist state in the first place. Native people don't really have power in the states. So it's a settler colonial fascist state. Whether you have freedom to buy fucking different brands of cereal or whatever the fuck, that doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? You still live in an oppressive state. So I mean, you can buy fucking ripped jeans. It doesn't mean you're fucking free. So
Are you optimistic for the future, Rick?
I am optimistic. I think once U.S. power breaks down abroad, domestically it's going to break down too, right? And eventually, this is why I push the decolonial theory.
Hmm.
People need to know what decolonization looks like when we move forward. Why native sovereignty is important. Why the black sovereignty, black liberation is also as important as indigenous sovereignty, because that's our allies, and vice versa. Right? If we don't understand Black history, people don't understand that colonization didn't start with colonization on this continent. It started with black Europeans taking black slaves. That happened before this continent happened. The colonization of this continent. If you read Joe Horn, right? You read Joe Horn, and you read, it was like the dawning of the apocalypse. You see how settler colonization started was through the colonization in Africa, then to the U.S. continent, and China simultaneously, and then globally, right? So it's just when we say decolonization, it's not just for this continent; it's for South America, China, I mean Asia, Africa as well. So it's a lot of stuff, man. People have to read. They need to stop watching Netflix.
Yeah, right. I mean, and to your theory, I mean, to your point about theory, I mean, theory is important too, but practice is important too.
Exactly.
You got to get out there and just like get into your community as far as like how do you organize, right? I mean, to me, it's just like I'm kind of done with political parties, whether it's third party, whether it's like Green Party, whether it's that. Just like to me, I really feel like the trap is electoral politics to an extent. Like I'm like with the Adolphus L. Reed Jr. kind of strategy, like vote where you got to vote, vote strategically, vote defensively, obviously try to keep as much of the fascism at bay as you can do, but don't waste any amount of like extra time on it. Like, don't be, knocking on doors for people. Don't be giving your money for people. Don't be giving your time. Like, show up, do the vote that you got to do, and then like start organizing like in your workplace, in your community. Because like I said, like with land back, it's just like what's it mean? Like even if you get it back, what are you gonna do with it? How
Exactly.
do you have healthy soil on that land? Can you grow food on that land? What's the water like? I mean, so like all that stuff kind of like comes together, and like you can get involved out there, like mutual aid. That's a much better way. Just like going out in your neighborhood, finding a community garden, and going from there is a much better way than like trying to waste time like organizing around a political party and electoral politics. It's gonna have you spinning your wheels, man.
Yeah, and I think also people have to realize you don't have to know everything about everything either. Like I don't know everything about everything. I have comrades around me that know more about stuff than I do. Like even Carl knows a lot more than I do with Chinese history, right? So I have Carl on. I have people on that know stuff. My specialty, or my specialty in what I study is very specific, right? And I mean there's um I think, but going back to what Stefan said, I think there are community organizations that help not undocumented immigrants. You can do that,
Right.
right? There's things about community gardens. There's things that feeding the homeless, and there's
Um,
things. Yeah,
shit.
food not bombs. Yeah, join the food not bombs. Help feeding homeless people. There's so many different topics, or issues you can tackle. You don't have to join a political party. Um, but I think because some parties, parties in the U.S. are all about themselves, gaining power among themselves. I mean, you can organize within your own community, and see what is what you're capable of. You know what I'm saying? But you should always read. You should like my share drive, the podcast share drive. You go to the Instagram um the Twitter. You can go to the podcast share drive, and there's a bunch of books about different topics, man. Read. And if you don't know something, join a study group, man. Right? Join a study group, and then read And study groups are usually like once a month, which is not that much time, and ask somebody like, hey, help me get through this book. Sometimes there's audiobooks you can find on YouTube to help you go through it. I mean, there's so many possibilities. I use audiobooks,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So I use audiobooks because sometimes reading is for people that haven't gone to college. Sometimes reading a book like that, like theory book, is hard. But sometimes if you find the audiobook on YouTube and you follow through with it, it's easier, right? Or just listen to the audiobook and ask questions with other people and have a study group. So there's so much stuff you can do, and I think people need to get out there. They need to get out fucking their couch, stop watching TV,
Right.
organize.
Yeah.
Yeah, TV is not that exciting.
Because
I had a question
you
before
know,
you, Rick.
like
Oh,
that,
sorry.
and the song that goes, the revolution will not be televised or broadcast live on the radio. It's not going to be live streamed. Like,
Yeah,
you got to get out there.
I wanted to ask you something, Rick. You had mentioned earlier that you want to see like the end of the U.S. settler government, correct?
yes.
If that were to come to an end, do you feel that with the population, like the normal people, average people, would come out of that unscathed, like economically or physically, or there would be uh, ramifications from that? Like it wouldn't be so simple for the government just to like disappear. Like people
There
would.
would be ramifications, 100% economically, because the supply chains would obviously be disrupted. I'm saying utilities too. I mean, the utilities are government, right? I see what I see happening is like people scrambling for power, right? Obviously, it's corporate leaders scrambling for power. I see right wing militias being in cahoots with the corporate powers. This is why it's really dangerous, And those motherfuckers are racist, so they're going to be a lot of people getting killed. I think they're going to use people like the evangelical population, which they are very fucking racist,
Yeah.
right?
Look at the more.
And yeah, the Mormons. So and the Mormons are very militant. They protect themselves from they are very organized with them amongst themselves. They will fucking kill you if you try to infiltrate them, right? So like, but so these the sellers are obviously organized to protect their own interests. We have to, as Native people, as Black people, as Mexican people, and everybody else that's not white, needs to get together and organize with each other, be in solidarity with each other, and that means understanding each other's struggles and looking for a path forward to what does decolonization mean to include everybody. Decolonization includes everybody, and it's for everybody too. So
Thanks for that answer. Yeah, I was curious on like how that would go about. So now I understand more. But
I mean, and for example, I want to say this too. Like, let's say for like uh the Navajo Nation, I think, has like 300,000, almost 300,000 people in it. They run infrastructure, they run programs, they run economies, they run all these things, within their own community. What other political party, I mean, other than the Democrats and Republicans, run infrastructure as much as Navajo Nation? This is a native government that has an economy that also hires non-native people. So we're here. There's 574 tribes in the U.S., sovereign communities that are running infrastructure. They have their own laws, their own constitutions. We have our own police systems, right? Where we can uphold the system itself. We are here and we're ready to take over if need be. We have the experience. We are the vanguard, right? But people need to realize and they need to understand and trust us, right? And understand our struggle. We're here.
yeah, thanks for that, Rick. I do believe.
Steven's laughing. Why are you laughing?
Oh,
Do you
no,
say the Vanguard?
it's Ivan.
This has been a very enlightening discussion. I think a lot of people were able to learn a lot of things that maybe they didn't know. Just wanted to say, Rick, I'm glad you brought up the opium war. Just wanted to say that like for a few seconds because the UK started that. I'm reading a
Yeah.
book right now about the opium war,
Mhm.
and they started that whole thing. They didn't have to go to war with China, but they did.
And that was the decade that when economic analysis has shown that's the decade where China stopped being historically the world's highest nation with the highest GDP. It's like we would measure it in the modern sense, and that Europe as a continent took off, and that was right around the time of the Opium Wars. And it's not a coincidence, you know what I mean? It's like they used that destruction of that wealth.
Oh yeah, they knew the Qing Empire was divided at that time as
Yeah.
well.
Oh, and it's crazy too because it just goes to speak on things that other, especially on the Black liberation side, of talk like the settler colonizers. They don't care how old your culture is. They don't care how ancient your culture is. They don't care how wise your culture is. And that's like that's the insidiousness of like getting stuck in a colonial mindset, right? Because people are like, oh, well, if we're just white enough, if we're just good enough Americans, or if we're just good enough capitalists, they'll respect us, and if we just show them, that we come from this long lineage, just this ancient thing, and it's just like it doesn't matter to them. You know what I mean? They could give two shits whether your civilization is 6,000 years old, 15,000 years old. They don't give a shit. They're trying to eradicate it. You know what I mean? And
There's a comment on the comments. There was like by this Thomas, Oklahoma. The 5 tribes of Oklahoma have a $15.6 billion economy, and they all have a bunch of programs and investments into their citizens. Yeah, standard of living is proving. Yeah, and that's the thing. We in Oklahoma, I did a paper during when I was in my master's degree about the gaming industry in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, we hire a ton of non-natives, right? We donate into like infrastructure, like fire departments, into local hospitals, right? So when our economies grow, it's not just a benefit for native people; it's a benefit for non-natives as well, right? Everybody benefits, and our economies are ran nationalistic. To be honest, our casinos are the most regulated in the world, and it's ran like nationalized, like it's like socialism, right? Everybody gets the same per cap, right? And people don't know that. So it's. I mean, what else do I have to say? You know what I'm saying? I mean, we might not be openly Marxist or anything like that. So there's a lot of natives that are against Marxism and whatever. They're libertarians or whatever. But our economies are ran for the benefit of all tribal members, right? And that's what we need. And we have a system in place where we could, take care of ourselves and and teach others how to take care of themselves too.
Yeah, Stephen, were you gonna say something?
Oh no, man! I'm just agreeing. That's right, man. Onward to a prosperous future. That's like
Yeah.
we started with that when we started it, Indigenous podcast. And
Yeah, onward.
I feel that's where we're going.
Yeah, yeah. At the end of the day, want a prosperous future for everyone, and I'm optimistic as well. But I'm glad that we could all share our thoughts. If anyone in the audience had any questions before we wrap this up, just drop a question in the comments. But yeah, unless you guys have anything else you want to add, Rick or Steven?
No, I think the only thing that's kind of off topic that I want to say that I think Stephen said that he was on the ship. And he passed through that part of by Singapore, whatever. I want to say that being on the ship and watching like the sunset and sunrise is the most amazing thing ever. So, just if you ever have experience of like going out to sea, I really highly recommend a sunrise or a sunset. It's, or seeing the night sky super clear out there since there's no like city lights and all that shit. So, I mean, everything's super clear out there. So, yeah, travel by sea if you can.
I have to make a note of that. I actually did one time. I was going to Belize, and it was just for like exploration, right? And we went from Belize City to this island called Cape Coker, and we went on a ship, and it was like during the sundown. It was very beautiful. So, guess I'll have to try to get to the Malacca Strait one day.
Yeah, gorgeous.
Dude, Marcus is always traveling, man. Marcus is always like, "Hey, I'll
Yeah.
hit you up later. I'm traveling." I'm like, what the fuck?
call him in the server, Mr. Worldwide.
Yeah, I guess still just exploring a little bit while I still can. One day I'll have a family, but just living it out a little bit longer. But yeah, guys, we can chat if you want for a little few minutes after once I end the stream. Um, I'm assuming no one had any questions, so for now, I just want to say thank you, audience, for coming in. Thank you, panelists. Shout out to Decolonize Buffalo and his podcast. Check him out. Shout out to Steven. Looking good, man. But yeah, we will finish this now. So thank you, guys.